This video is going to be all about how to remove a stuck piston in a brake caliper. This particular car we've been rebuilding for the last 2 years, and it certainly hasn't moved in that time, and probably for several years before. So I've just finished remaking all the brake lines, and I was going to bleed the master cylinder and test the brakes until it occurred to me that the chances of the brake pistons actually moving free in the calipers would be almost zero on a car that's probably sat for 10 years. In most cases, the easiest way to get a brake piston from a caliper would be in situ. So you take the wheel off, take the brake disc off, squeeze your foot on the brake pedal, the pistons will come out and you'll be able to take them out just using the hydraulic pressure from the master cylinder. But that's not always going to be possible. Sometimes the brake piston will actually be rusted or seized solid in the caliper, and no amount of bashing your foot on the brake pedal will loosen it. And sometimes there'll be no brake fluid in the system because you're rebuilding the whole system, and in order to use the master cylinder you would have to effectively fill the system up with brake fluid, bleed it, and then use the pedal that way, which we don't want to do. You could potentially use an old brake master cylinder to get the pistons out the caliper, but what we're going to do is actually take the caliper off the car and try and remove the pistons with the caliper off the car. So here's the caliper removed off the car. It's just held on by 2 bolts, and obviously there's a flexible hose attached to it. Now sometimes the flexible hose will be seized at the brake line and you actually have to unscrew the caliper to get this off. You'll probably also need something like a breaker bar because the torque spec on these bolts is, I think, over 100 Newton meters, and sometimes there's actually thread lock on them as well. But here's the caliper here. Once you've taken the caliper off, my advice would be to use something like an old brake bleed nipple or the fittings you get on a new brake master cylinder just to stop brake fluid leaking all over your bench. Taking the brake pads out is simply a matter of knocking out these pins here and removing the spring, and then the brake pads should just slide out. The only thing I would say is if you're doing this over a hard floor, make sure that they don't slide out and fall and shatter on the floor. So the brake pads should just slide out like so. And behind the brake pads are the brake pistons, but in the case of a Mercedes R107, they're covered by this thin piece of alloy or tin here, which is effectively a heat shield for the piston. Now, 9 times out of 10, that'll be rusted solid onto the piston and you won't simply be able to lift it out. So these are still available, and if you end up damaging yours when it comes out, you can replace them. They're not that expensive, but you can see that this is rusty here and it's not something that I'd want to put back on the car. So that leaves you with the piston here. Now, how on earth do you get that piston out of the caliper? If your piston is not too seized in there, you can use a set of piston mole grips, and the idea here is that you adjust them to whatever you need to adjust them to, and then lock them against the piston, and then wiggle this back and forwards, pulling it and wiggling it to see if that comes out. Now you can see that these piston mole grips, although they have kind of ridges on here, these little semicircles here are really designed for motorbike pistons, which are much smaller. Ideally you want a semicircle that fits in there that's much bigger and heftier, and even then you might struggle. But that piston is not moving at all, no matter how much force we apply to this. Now plan B is we've taken these calipers apart just by taking these 4 bolts out, and that not just reveals these seals here, which we're going to be replacing, but will allow us potentially to get better access to these pistons to try and get them out. What we're going to do is we're going to heat up this piston here and melt the rubber, because at the moment this is not budging, and by heating it up the outside should expand. Now what you could do is blast the inside with some freeze spray. So what some people do to release a seized piston is put the whole thing in the oven, take it out, blast the piston with freeze spray, and that helps. But what I think is happening is the rubber seal is just welded on there, and if we melt that off we may get some movement. There is another method of trying to wind these out, and that's by packing the hole with small sockets and then using a breaker bar to try and twist that out. Now this is so seized in there that I've actually managed to bend my 10mm socket. It doesn't actually matter which order you put these in, so if you're ever going to try this yourself, I've got a 7mm here, a 8mm here, bearing in mind that the end of the breaker bar is going in here. Then I've got a 10mm, which is now bent. We've got a 9mm here and a 15/32 on the outside, and in the middle we have a 3/8. If you don't have a breaker bar, you could also try jamming in a Allen key in there as well. That also sometimes works, but we're going to have to go and find ourselves a decent vise to hold this tight and try again. Now sometimes if the piston is out a little bit, you can try putting the caliper in a vise and actually pushing the piston in, because once that rust is broken, you should be able to wind the piston out. So we're going to have a go at doing that. Oh my lordy, I have never seen that before. This has actually broken the piston. Wow. Maybe that will allow us to get this seal out, which will allow us to wind that out. Let's try that. Now that we've got that inner seal out, we've put a little bit of plus gas in there, and I reckon, look at that, we can see that that is now moving. Let's see if we can get that bit of seal there out. Whoa. So now we're just going to use these and lift up at the same time. So we've got this turning now, but it's not coming out because basically there's a ridge of rust here stopping it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill a hole in the bottom. I'm going to tap some threads in there. So we've just gone through there now. There's a couple of mil before this drill bit hits the bottom there, so we should be able to drill a little bit more, but what we're trying to avoid doing is drilling into the back of the caliper. Just using our helicoil set, we've drilled a hole in the bottom of that piston, and now we are just winding in the tap that comes with the helicoil set, and in theory winding that in should push the piston out. So after hours of battling, I think we finally got it. I think this piston is winding out now. Oh my sweet mother. It has taken days to get this piston out, and finally there we are. We can have a little look at the inside of this. Now that we've got that piston out, you can see just what happens if that outer dust seal has a little tear in it or allows any moisture in there. It starts rusting, and then the edge of the caliper itself starts rusting, and then you get a ridge of rust out around here, which makes it very, very difficult, if not impossible, to push the piston out with hydraulic pressure. But we got there in the end with our Heath Robinson Plan B. Now when you rebuild calipers, you'll get all the seals. Once again, you can see it's just a little bit rusty inside there.
Yeah,
so
there's like rusty liquid in there as well.
That's just what we'll do, is we'll try and clean that out, and hopefully that will still be usable. Just arrived in the post the day after we bought it is a caliper refurb kit from this company here, BiggRed. We bought this on eBay with a 10% discount code. It costs us £42 delivered for both front calipers, and that will come with 4 pistons. You can see that those pistons are considerably better than the ones we took off. It'll come with the heat shield, the seal that goes inside the caliper, the small seal here that sits on the top, the dust shield, and also I think that's a bleed nipple dust cover. In these caliper rebuild kits you also get a little sachet of silicone grease, and this is actually for the brake pad pins. Some people do use a little dab of this on the internal seals on the piston, but it's probably better that you use brake fluid for that internal square cut rubber seal and brake fluid on the piston rather than putting any silicone grease in there. What you must never do is put any petroleum based oil or grease on any rubber parts. If your calipers are still available with the pistons and all the seals in them for a reasonable price, you might be much better off just getting a new caliper. But these older Mercedes calipers are quite difficult to get hold of, and in the case of our SL55, for example, the calipers there, the AMG calipers, cost anything between £400 to £600 for second-hand ones if you can get them. So sometimes buying a whole new caliper is just not an option. I'm going to leave this video here. We still have to get all the pistons out of the other calipers, and I will do that off camera. And in the next video, hopefully we'll be in a position where we can bleed the brake system and actually try the brakes on this car, probably for the first time in 10 years.